The airport was alive with noise, rolling suitcases clattering against tiled floors, families exchanging tearful goodbyes, and announcements echoing through tinny speakers. But amidst the chaos, one man stood frozen, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. Captain Daniel Hayes had dreamed of this moment for years. After 3 long deployments overseas, he was finally home. He scanned the crowded terminal, searching for the faces he'd memorized in countless late-night video calls. His wife, Sarah, would be here, her warm smile lighting up even the dreariest corners of his mind. And their daughter, Emily, little Emily, who used to fit perfectly in his arms when she was just a toddler. But as his eyes landed on them standing near Gate 27, something felt off. Sarah waved at him, her face glowing with relief and joy. Beside her stood a girl, tall, slender, with wavy auburn hair cascading down her shoulders. She looked about 10 or 11 now, though it was hard to tell under the oversized hoodie she wore. Her cheeks were flushed pink from excitement, and her lips curved into a tentative smile. Daniel blinked. That couldn't be Emily, could it? His memories of her were hazy, clouded by time zones and endless patrols. In his mind, she was still that chubby-cheeked toddler giggling as he spun her around the living room. This girl before him seemed almost foreign. Before he could process further, the girl broke free from Sarah's side and sprinted toward him, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "Daddy!" she cried, throwing her arms wide open. For a split second, Daniel hesitated. He wanted to scoop her up, to feel the weight of her in his arms again, to reclaim the connection they once shared. But instead, he found himself rooted to the spot, staring at her as if seeing a ghost. "Emily?" he managed to choke out, his voice hoarse. She stopped short, her arms dropping to her sides. For a fleeting moment, hurt flickered across her face. But then she tilted her head and whispered, so softly only he could hear, "Daddy, do you really not know who I am?" Daniel felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The bustling airport faded into a blur of muffled sounds and distant echoes. All he could focus on was the girl standing in front of him, the girl who claimed to be his daughter but looked nothing like the child etched in his memory. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a cautious step closer, studying him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. There was something unnervingly mature about the way she carried herself, like she'd aged far beyond her years in the time he'd been away. Behind them, Sarah approached cautiously. "Danny," she said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "It's okay. It's been a while." Her words trailed off, but Daniel caught the hesitation in her tone. Something wasn't right. "I don't understand," he murmured, glancing between his wife and his supposed daughter. "She looks different." Different wasn't even the word for it. This girl bore no resemblance to the bubbly toddler he remembered. Her features were sharper, her posture more guarded. Even her voice carried a depth that didn't belong to a child. Emily crossed her arms over her chest, her expression shifting from vulnerability to defiance. "You wouldn't recognize me anyway," she muttered under her breath. "What did you say?" Daniel leaned down slightly, trying to meet her gaze. She looked away, biting her lip. Then, after a pause, she added, "Because I'm not who you think I am." The statement hit him like a punch to the gut. Not who he thought she was. What did that even mean? Was this some kind of prank? A coping mechanism born out of loneliness during his absence? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? Sarah stepped in quickly, sensing the tension building between father and daughter. "Let's get home first," she suggested, forcing a smile. "We can talk there." Reluctantly, Daniel nodded. As they walked toward the exit, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. Every glance Emily threw his way felt weighted, every movement deliberate. And yet, despite the unease gnawing at him, he couldn't help but notice how familiar she seemed in other ways. The way she tugged at her hoodie sleeves reminded him of Sarah. The faint freckles dusting her nose mirrored his own. So why did she feel like a stranger? By the time they reached the car, Daniel's mind was racing. He tried to piece together fragments of memories from before his deployment. Family dinners, bedtime stories, lazy Sunday mornings, but everything felt disjointed, incomplete. It was as if someone had taken snapshots of his life and rearranged them into a puzzle he couldn't solve. As they drove home, Sarah attempted small talk, filling the silence with updates about work, school, and neighborhood gossip. But Daniel barely registered her words. His attention kept drifting to the rearview mirror, where Emily sat quietly, staring out the window. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of her reflection, her profile illuminated by passing streetlights. When they arrived at the house, a modest two-story suburban home, he felt a pang of nostalgia. This place had always been his sanctuary, a refuge from the horrors of war. Yet tonight it felt alien, almost hostile. Inside, Sarah ushered them into the living room, offering coffee and snacks. Emily perched on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie. Daniel sank into an armchair across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, he blurted out, "Emily, what did you mean earlier about not being who I think you are?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously. Then, without warning, she burst into tears. I didn't want to tell you like this," she stammered between sobs. "But Mom said we couldn't keep lying to you forever." Lying? Daniel's blood ran cold. Sarah rushed to comfort Emily, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured. "We'll explain everything." Turning to Daniel, she sighed deeply. "There's something you need to know. Something we should have told you sooner." Daniel's pulse quickened. Whatever this secret was, it clearly went deeper than a simple case of mistaken identity. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Sarah exchanged a glance with Emily, who nodded reluctantly. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began. "When you left for your last deployment, things changed. A lot. And one of those changes," she paused, swallowing hard, "was Emily." Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of coffee. She glanced at Emily, who had buried her face in her hands, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Danny," Sarah began, her voice shaky but determined, "when you left for your last deployment, something happened. Something we didn't know how to explain, or even understand ourselves." Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about? What happened?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "It started about 6 months after you deployed. Emily, she wasn't herself anymore. At first, it was little things, changes in her behavior, mood swings, nightmares. But then," her voice cracked, and she looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Emily finally spoke up, her voice barely audible. "I stopped being me." Daniel frowned, confusion etched across his face. "What do you mean, stopped being you?" Sarah continued, her tone heavy with guilt. "One night, she woke up screaming. When I went to check on her, she was sitting upright in bed, staring blankly at the wall. Her eyes, they weren't hers. It was like someone else was looking out through them." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Someone else." Emily nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "That's when she showed up." "She?" Daniel echoed, his mind racing. Sarah nodded grimly. "We don't know who or what she is. All we know is that ever since that night, Emily hasn't been the same. Sometimes she acts like herself, but other times—" She trailed off, glancing nervously at their daughter. "Other times, it's like she's possessed," Emily finished bluntly. The room fell silent. Daniel stared at his wife and daughter, trying to process what he'd just heard. Possession? Was this some kind of psychological issue? Or was there something supernatural at play? "You're saying," he started, struggling to find the right words, "that someone or something is inside her?" Emily nodded again, her expression haunted. "Her name is Lily, and she says she knows you." Daniel's head spun. He felt like he'd stepped into a nightmare, one where nothing made sense and every answer only raised more questions. "Lily?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Who is Lily? How does she know me? Emily hesitated, glancing at her mother for reassurance. When Sarah gave her a small nod, she turned back to Daniel. She says she's been watching us, Emily whispered. Watching you. She told me stories about you. Things no one else could possibly know. What kind of stories? Daniel demanded, his pulse quickening. Emily swallowed hard. About your time overseas. About the choices you made. About the people you lost. Daniel froze. Those were private memories. Buried so deep he hadn't spoken of them to anyone. Not even Sarah. How could this entity know such intimate details? And she said something else, Emily added softly. Something I didn't understand until now. What did she say? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She said, he won't recognize you because he doesn't want to remember. The words hit him like a freight train. Memories he tried so desperately to suppress began flooding back. Faces of fallen comrades, the sound of gunfire echoing in his ears, the weight of decisions that haunted him still. No, he muttered, shaking his head. This isn't real. You're making this up. We wish we were, Sarah interjected, her voice breaking. But it's true, Danny. For the past 2 years we've been living with this thing. We didn't tell you because we thought it would be too much for you to handle while you were deployed. But now what? Daniel snapped, his frustration boiling over. You expect me to believe my own daughter has been replaced by some ghost or demon or whatever this is? It's not that simple, Emily pleaded, her voice rising. Lily isn't just taking over my body. She's part of me now. She knows everything I know. And more. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the room. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, denial. None of this made any sense. Yet, deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Prove it, he said suddenly, stopping in front of Emily. If this Lily really knows me, let her prove it. Emily blinked, startled by his demand. Then, without warning, her demeanor shifted. Her posture straightened, her gaze sharpened, and her voice changed, becoming colder, sharper, almost menacing. Is that what you want, Daniel? She asked, her tone eerily calm. Proof. Daniel recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. That voice, it wasn't Emily's. Tell me something only I would know, he challenged, his voice trembling. The girl smiled, a chilling, unnatural smile. Do you remember Corporal Ramirez? The one who died saving your life during Operation Black Dawn. Daniel staggered backward, his knees buckling beneath him. No one knew about Ramirez, not even Sarah. He'd never spoken of that day to anyone. How do you know that? He stammered, his voice barely audible. Because I was there, the voice replied. And I've been waiting for you to come home. Before Daniel could respond, Emily's body convulsed violently, and she collapsed onto the couch, unconscious. Sarah rushed to her side, cradling her head in her lap. Emily! Emily, wake up! She cried, panic overtaking her. Daniel stood frozen, his mind reeling. What had just happened? Was this real, or was he losing his grip on reality? After a few tense moments, Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were her own again. Soft, vulnerable, filled with tears. I'm sorry, Daddy, she whimpered, clutching her mother's hand. I didn't mean to scare you. Daniel sank back into his chair, overwhelmed. He wanted to dismiss everything as a figment of his imagination, but the evidence was undeniable. Whatever was happening to Emily was beyond anything he'd ever encountered. Sarah, he said finally, his voice strained. We need help, professional help. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. We've tried everything, Danny. Doctors, therapists, even priests. Nothing works. She's stuck like this. Daniel clenched his fists, determination hardening his features. Then we'll keep trying. There has to be a way to fix this, to bring our daughter back. But as he looked at Emily, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about saving her. It was also about confronting the ghosts of his own past, the ones he'd tried so desperately to leave behind. And somewhere deep inside, he feared that Lily wasn't done with him yet. Daniel spent the rest of the night pacing the house, his mind a storm of unanswered questions. The weight of what he'd witnessed pressed down on him like an invisible force, making it impossible to sit still. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, made him glance over his shoulder, half expecting something, or someone, to appear. Sarah had finally coaxed Emily back to bed, tucking her in with trembling hands and whispered reassurances. But Daniel couldn't bring himself to leave the living room. He sat at the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the coffee table, replaying the evening's events in his head. Corporal Ramirez's name echoed in his thoughts, dredging up memories he'd buried long ago. How could this entity know about him? What did it want from his family? And why now, after all these years? The clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. Sleep felt like an impossibility. Just as exhaustion began to dull the edges of his anxiety, a faint sound caught his attention, a soft whisper coming from upstairs. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't loud enough to wake Sarah, but it was unmistakable. "Emily," he muttered under his breath, rising quickly to his feet. He climbed the stairs silently, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached her bedroom door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. Through the crack beneath the door, he saw flickering shadows dancing across the floor, though no light should have been on inside. Slowly, he pushed the door open. What he saw froze him in place. Emily was sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide open but unfocused, staring straight ahead as if transfixed by something only she could see. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't hear. The air around her seemed charged, almost electric, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. "Emily?" he whispered, stepping closer. Her head snapped toward him, and for a moment, he thought he saw recognition in her gaze. But then her expression shifted, her features hardened, and that same cold smile spread across her face. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and guttural, nothing like his daughter's. "Lily?" Daniel breathed, his stomach twisting. She tilted her head, studying him with an unsettling intensity. "You've been running for so long, Daniel. Running from your guilt, your pain, your choices. Did you really think coming home would make it all disappear?" "I don't know what you're talking about," he shot back, though his voice betrayed his unease. "Oh, but you do," she replied, her tone dripping with mockery. "You left us behind, didn't you?" Left him behind. The mention of Ramirez sent a jolt through him. "I didn't have a choice," he snapped, his voice rising. "He knew the risks. We all did. And yet, you live while he rots in the ground," she countered, her words cutting deeper than any blade. "Do you think he forgives you? Do you think they forgive you?" "Stop it," Daniel shouted, clenching his fists. "Leave my daughter alone." For a split second, Lily's smirk faltered, replaced by something darker, something angrier. "You don't get to tell me what to do," she hissed. "Not when you abandoned her. Not when you abandoned all of them." Before he could respond, Emily's body convulsed again, her head snapping back violently. A strangled cry escaped her lips, and then she collapsed onto the mattress, unconscious once more. Daniel rushed to her side, checking her pulse and brushing hair from her sweat-drenched forehead. She was alive, but barely. Trembling, he pulled the blanket over her and turned to leave the room. As he stepped into the hallway, he realized Sarah was standing there, pale-faced and wide-eyed. "How much did you hear?" he asked quietly. "Enough," she replied, her voice hollow. "We can't keep going like this, Danny. We need answers. Real ones." He nodded, though he had no idea where to start. Whatever Lily was, whatever hold she had over Emily, it wasn't going to let go easily. And as much as he wanted to deny it, deep down, he knew this wasn't just about saving his daughter. It was about facing the parts of himself he'd tried so hard to forget. Over the next few days, Daniel threw himself into researching anything that might explain what was happening. He scoured the internet for stories of possession, consulted obscure forums, and even reached out to a retired military chaplain who specialized in paranormal phenomena. Each lead felt like grasping at straws, but he refused to give up. One name kept appearing in his searches: Dr. Evelyn Carter, a psychologist known for her work with patients experiencing dissociative identity disorders. Though her expertise leaned toward the scientific rather than the supernatural, Daniel decided she was worth a shot. When he called her office, the receptionist informed him that Dr. Carter was booked solid for weeks. Desperate, Daniel explained the situation, emphasizing the urgency. To his surprise, she agreed to squeeze them in the following afternoon. The drive to Dr. Carter's clinic was tense. Emily sat in the back seat, unusually quiet, while Sarah fidgeted nervously beside him. Neither of them spoke, the weight of the unknown hanging heavily between them. Dr. Carter turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s, with an air of calm authority that put Daniel slightly at ease. After introductions, she ushered them into her office, a cozy space filled with bookshelves and soft lighting. "So," she began, folding her hands on the desk, "tell me everything." And for the first time since returning home, Daniel found himself laying bare not just the events of the past few days, but the secrets he'd carried for years. As he spoke, he watched Dr. Carter's expression shift from curiosity to concern. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. "This is unusual," she admitted, "but not entirely unprecedented. There are documented cases of extreme trauma manifesting in ways that mimic possession or alternate personalities. However," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "there are elements of your story that suggest something beyond psychology. If you're willing, I'd like to run some tests. Not just on Emily, but on all of you." Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah, who gave a hesitant nod. Whatever it took, they were ready. As they left the clinic later that day, Daniel felt a flicker of hope for the first time in what felt like forever. But as they approached their car, he noticed something strange. A single red rose lying on the hood, its petals glistening with dew despite the dry weather. Beneath it was a note, written in elegant script. "You can't run forever, Daniel." The sight of the rose and the cryptic note sent a chill coursing through Daniel's veins. He snatched it off the car hood, crumpling it in his fist as if trying to erase its existence. Sarah noticed his reaction immediately. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with alarm. "Nothing," he lied, shoving the note into his pocket. "Let's just get home." But the words on the paper burned in his mind like acid. "You can't run forever, Daniel." Run from what? From Lily? From his past? Or from something even darker that he hadn't yet uncovered? The drive back was suffocating silent. Emily stared out the window, her reflection pale against the darkening sky. Whatever part of her had been present during their meeting with Dr. Carter seemed to have retreated again, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not just by Lily, but by something far more insidious. When they arrived home, he insisted on checking every room, every corner, every shadow. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease lingered, clinging to him like a second skin. That night, sleep eluded him entirely. Instead, he sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, poring over old journals and letters from his time overseas. Maybe, he thought, there was a clue buried in his own memories, something he'd overlooked or forgotten. Hours passed before he found it. A faded photograph tucked between the pages of a worn notebook. It was a group shot of his unit taken shortly before Operation Black Dawn. In the background, barely visible, stood a figure partially obscured by shadows. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a trick of the light. But as Daniel squinted closer, his blood ran cold. The figure wasn't wearing a uniform, and its face bore an uncanny resemblance to Emily. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's impossible." He flipped the photo over, searching for any notes or context. On the back, scrawled in hurried handwriting, were 3 words: "She was there." His hands trembled as he set the picture down. Who or what had been there? Had someone known about Lily all along? Or was this some cruel coincidence meant to unravel him further? Before he could process the implications, a noise from upstairs jolted him upright. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. They weren't coming from Emily's room. "Sarah?" he called out, rising cautiously. No answer. Gripping the baseball bat he kept near the door, he ascended the stairs one cautious step at a time. The sound led him to the attic, a space they rarely used, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten relics of their lives before deployment. The door creaked open slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness within. "Hello?" he said, his voice steadier than he felt. A soft laugh answered him. A child's laugh, high-pitched and melodic. Then silence. Heart pounding, Daniel pushed the door wider and flicked on the light. The bulb flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the cluttered space. At first glance, everything appeared normal. But then he saw it. A small wooden box sitting in the center of the floor, its surface etched with strange symbols he didn't recognize. It hadn't been there before. Kneeling beside it, he hesitated, his instincts screaming at him not to touch it. Yet curiosity, or maybe desperation, won out. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of items that made no sense individually but together formed a horrifying mosaic. A lock of red hair tied with a black ribbon, a dog tag engraved with Ramirez's name, and a folded piece of paper bearing a single sentence written in the same elegant script as the note from earlier. "You brought her home with you." Daniel slammed the lid shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't happening. None of this was real. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. As he turned to leave, the laughter returned. Louder this time, almost mocking. Spinning around, he scanned the room, but there was no one there. Just the box, sitting innocently where he'd left it. By the time he stumbled downstairs, Sarah was awake, clutching a robe around herself. "What's wrong?" she demanded, taking in his ashen face. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now." "Leave? Why? What happened?" "I don't know how to explain it," he admitted, grabbing his phone and keys. "But this house isn't safe anymore. Neither are we." Sarah hesitated, glancing toward Emily's room. "What about her?" "She's coming with us," Daniel said firmly. "Whatever's happening, it's connected to her and to me. If we stay, we're putting her in danger." They woke Emily gently, bundling her into the car without explanation. She didn't protest, too exhausted or too detached to question their sudden departure. As they sped away from the house, Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching them from the porch. But the street was empty. For now. The hours that followed were a blur of highways, rest stops, and whispered arguments. Sarah wanted answers, demanded them, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to explain. How could he tell her that he'd found a box in their attic containing fragments of their lives intertwined with something unnatural? That he suspected Lily wasn't just haunting Emily but had been brought into their world because of him? "We can't keep running like this," Sarah snapped finally, breaking the tense silence in the car. "You're scaring her." Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror at Emily, who sat slumped against the window, staring blankly at the passing landscape. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She hadn't spoken since they left the house. "I'm trying to protect her," Daniel shot back, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Do you think I want to drag her through this? Whatever's happening, it's connected to me, to my past. And until I figure out why, we're not safe, not anywhere." The drive to the abandoned military base was long and grueling, each mile dragging them deeper into a landscape of desolation. The map on the wall had led them here, to Operation Black Dawn's Ground Zero, a place Daniel hadn't set foot in since that fateful night. Memories clawed at him with every turn of the wheel. The sound of gunfire, the weight of Ramirez's lifeless body in his arms, the choices he'd made under fire that still haunted his dreams. When they arrived, the base was as barren as he remembered. Crumbling structures stood like skeletal remains against the gray horizon, their windows shattered and walls pockmarked with bullet holes. The air carried the faint tang of rust and decay, a reminder of the violence that had unfolded here years ago. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice heavy with dread. "Whatever she wants, it's here." Sarah nodded, clutching Emily's hand tightly. "Then let's finish this." They moved cautiously through the ruins, following the path marked on the map until they reached a bunker buried beneath layers of debris. Its steel door hung slightly ajar, groaning softly in the wind. Inside, the darkness swallowed them whole, broken only by the beam of Daniel's flashlight. The space was eerily intact compared to the rest of the base, a relic frozen in time. Faded maps lined the walls, and overturned chairs lay scattered across the floor. But what caught Daniel's attention was the center of the room. A crude altar fashioned from scraps of wood and metal, adorned with candles melted down to stubs and photographs pinned haphazardly around it. One photo stood out among the others. It was of Corporal Ramirez, smiling broadly in full uniform. Beneath it lay another picture, one Daniel hadn't seen before. In it, Ramirez stood beside a young girl with auburn hair and freckles, her features unmistakably similar to Emily's. "Who is she?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Before Daniel could answer, Emily stepped forward, drawn to the altar as if by an invisible force. Her movements were mechanical, her expression blank. "She's my sister," came a voice, not Emily's but Lily's. Daniel spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one else in the room. The voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, filling the bunker with its chilling resonance. "What are you talking about?" Daniel demanded. "Ramirez didn't have a sister." "Oh, but he did," Lily replied, her tone dripping with sorrow. "And you left her behind too." The pieces began to fall into place, jagged and painful. During the operation, Ramirez had mentioned a younger sibling once, a girl he hoped to reunite with after their tour ended. Daniel had dismissed it as idle chatter, never imagining it would matter. "I don't understand," Daniel whispered, shaking his head. "What does this have to do with us?" "With Emily?" Lily laughed bitterly, the sound reverberating through the bunker. "You think your actions exist in a vacuum? Every choice you made that night rippled outward, affecting lives you couldn't see. When Ramirez died, so did any chance his sister had at a future. And when you came home alive, well, let's just say the universe has a way of balancing things." "No," Daniel breathed, horror dawning on his face. "You're saying—" "I'm saying she found me," Lily continued. "In the aftermath of your war, I wandered without purpose until I felt her pain calling to me. I became her anger, her grief, and now I am hers completely. But I am also yours, Daniel, because you created this chain of suffering." Emily collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please stop," she begged, clutching her head. "I can't hold her anymore." Daniel rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. "Fight her, sweetheart. You're stronger than this." But Lily wasn't done yet. "You want her back?" she taunted. "Then give me what I came for. Face the truth you've been running from all these years." The room grew colder, the shadows thickening around them. A figure materialized slowly in the corner. A young woman with auburn hair and hollow eyes, her presence both ethereal and menacing. She stared at Daniel, accusation burning in her gaze. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice raw with anguish. "My brother, my life, my peace. I didn't mean to," Daniel choked out, guilt crushing him. "I tried to save him. I swear I did. But you failed," she spat. "And now, because of you, I'll never know what it means to live." For a moment, silence consumed the bunker. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "He may have failed," she said firmly, addressing the apparition. "But he's not the man he was then. He's trying to make things right. For Emily, for us, for himself. If you need someone to blame, take me instead. Let her go." The figure hesitated, her expression softening ever so slightly. For the first time, doubt flickered in her gaze. "And what would you give up?" she asked quietly. "Anything," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Just let my daughter be free." The tension in the room shifted, the oppressive weight lifting fractionally. Slowly, the figure turned to Emily, who sat trembling in Daniel's arms. "You carry my pain," she said, her voice gentler now. "But it doesn't belong to you. Release it." With those words, she dissolved into light, vanishing as suddenly as she had appeared. The temperature normalized, the shadows receded, and the oppressive energy dissipated entirely. Emily gasped, her body going limp in Daniel's embrace. For the first time in months, her eyes were clear, her own. "It's over," she whispered, her voice shaky but unmistakably hers. But as they left the bunker and returned to the car, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw a pair of hollow eyes watching them from the distance. And though they drove away from the base, he knew one thing for certain. Some ghosts never truly leave. Sarah opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself, shaking her head. "You're losing yourself again, Danny. Just like before. You shut everyone out when things get hard. But this isn't about you anymore. It's about us. About our daughter." Her words stung, not because they were wrong but because they hit too close to the truth. He was shutting them out, retreating into the same isolation that had defined his years overseas. But how could he let them in when he didn't even understand what they were facing? As night fell, they pulled into a small motel off the interstate. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the office door, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. While Sarah checked them in, Daniel stayed with Emily, watching her carefully. She seemed almost catatonic, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. When Sarah returned with the keycard, she knelt beside Emily, brushing hair from her face. "Sweetheart," she murmured, "we're going to figure this out. I promise." Emily blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream. Then, in a voice so soft it barely carried, she said, "She's still here." Daniel froze. "Who? Lily?" Emily whispered, her lips trembling. "She won't leave me alone." Before either parent could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging the parking lot into darkness. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Cars nearby began honking erratically, their alarms triggered by some unseen force. "Get inside," Daniel barked, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the room. They barely made it through the door before chaos erupted outside. The hum turned into a deafening roar, and shadows danced across the walls despite the absence of light. Emily clung to her mother, sobbing uncontrollably, while Daniel barricaded the door with furniture. "It's okay," Sarah whispered to Emily, though her own voice quaked with fear. "We're safe. We're together." But Daniel knew better. Whatever was happening, it wasn't confined to their home, or even to Emily. It was following them, hunting them. As the noise subsided, an oppressive silence settled over the room. Daniel lit a candle, its flickering flame casting grotesque shapes on the walls. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Emily lifted her head, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the dim light. "She says she wants to show you something," Emily said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Show me what?" Daniel asked, his heart pounding. Instead of answering, Emily stood and walked to the far corner of the room. There, she pointed to the wall, a plain, unremarkable stretch of faded wallpaper. At first, Daniel saw nothing unusual. But then, slowly, faint markings began to appear, etched into the surface as if by an invisible hand. It was a map. Roads, landmarks, and symbols formed a web of information that seemed to pulse with energy. One location was circled repeatedly, marked with a single word written in bold letters: home. Daniel's stomach churned. Home. Not the house they'd fled, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere tied to his past. "What is this?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer. "It's where it started," Daniel said quietly, realization dawning. "Where everything went wrong." "You mean Ramirez?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. He nodded grimly. "We need to go there. If we don't confront it, if I don't face what happened, we'll never be free of her." Sarah stared at him, torn between fear and resolve. Finally, she sighed. Then we go. Together.